Sir, how are we gonna win this?
Don't worry, son. I know something these enemies will never know. Strategy in Dungeons & Dragons. Hi, welcome back to the MidMasq channel. Hi, if you're new here, we talk about Dungeons & Dragons, and this is the MidMasq channel. Strategy in Dungeons & Dragons is one of my favorite things to think about. As a dungeon master, you're constantly plotting very evil and sinister plans against your players, or as a player, you are trying to ruin the life of your dungeon master. I'm joking, but I'm not really joking, but I'm joking at the same time. But before we get into any of that, I would like to say that the majority of you, are still not subscribed. So, if you enjoyed the content here, feel free to do that. But without further ado, why don't we talk about how you, yes you, the one watching this, can become a master strategist in Dungeons & Dragons. Strategy, no matter what side of the coin you're on, DM or player, will help you succeed in everything. Now, of course, as with all things, this video is not meant to be the end-all of be-all of how to get good at Dungeons & Dragons. There's so many different things to Dungeons & Dragons that it's really the experience that makes you get better, but these are just a few things you can do to do things just a little bit better. So as I mentioned, this video will be kind of split up between strategy for the Dungeon Master and strategy for the player. And we are going to start with strategy as a Dungeon Master. Your goal as a Dungeon Master is to challenge your players, whether it be challenging combat, interesting puzzles, or just a fascinating adventure. But the problem is, many Dungeon Masters come up with a premise, an adventure, a combat, whatever it is, just, like, oh, that's a good idea, I should go put that in my game, and let the players run through it. And then they let the players run through it, without thinking about the smaller details that really matter to any situation in Dungeons & Dragons. That's why strategy is so vital as a Dungeon Master. Being able to pick up on these smaller things that your players are doing and the way they play the game will allow you to create a more tailored experience and perhaps a more challenging one. Most players tend to have a common theme on how they play a character. Whether it be they like one spell more than the others, so they tend to use that one more, or perhaps they have a specific strategy that they consistently go for. Say the fighter likes to circle back and use the flanking rule that you have in your game, and they like to do that over and over and over and over again. Or perhaps your wizard just likes making things explode over and over and over again. No matter how your players play, you should take note of how they're doing it. What they like to do and what they don't like to do. What are they avoiding? What do they like to do? What's their favorite color? This might all seem somewhat disjointed, but it's important to take note of this, because if you're going to make a combat encounter, an adventure, or even a puzzle, finding ways to challenge your players is important. Say you have a combat encounter that counters a specific comfort zone that one of your players has, or perhaps all of your players. Have some enemies able to swat the fireballs of the wizard out of the air, so they have to come up with a new strategy. Forcing your players out of their comfort zone is one of the most important things you can do as a DM. Whether it is combat and you have enemies doing these crazy things to make the party do something else, or perhaps it's a puzzle where it cannot just be solved using brute force or just a simple intelligence check, and actually requires more input and thought on the player's part. Or perhaps the opposite. Say there's a couple of lesser used features that one of your characters have. Say you're in a steampunk setting, and one of your characters actually has a proficiency for a land vehicle. Except that's never really used. There's very little situations where some of these like artisan tools or vehicle proficiencies are used, so perhaps maybe forming an adventure where your party has to utilize these more obscure features on their sheets might breathe some new life that you need in your campaign. Basically, the point of all this is to just stretch out what your players are doing. Because getting stuck in the same, oh, there's an enemy, hit him, hit him, hit him, or perhaps the wizard, where he's just casting fireball over and over and over again because there's nothing to challenge that. But if you don't like this idea of perhaps countering your players with combat, or countering them with a puzzle or adventure, however you'd like to put it, there's a couple of other things you can do. Namely, having combat encounters, specifically, have environmental factors is something many DMs know about. having a pillar get pushed over to do some additional damage, or perhaps just bring the building down onto whatever poor thing you're trying to kill. Often these environmental factors don't really focus on the creatures themselves, which are, as you can imagine, one of the most important parts of the combat. So I recommend as a Dungeon Master, and I mentioned this in another video where I exclusively talk about D&D enemies, which you can find in whatever one of these corners, is giving your enemies strategy themselves. Whether it be an army of ghost knights, or perhaps just a cult of wizards, there's a couple of interesting things you could do with that. You are actively using their intelligence stat, which otherwise goes unused for many creatures, and adding an extra layer to the combat. Perhaps the cult can keep buffing each other, so you kind of have to time which one you kill first before they can rebuff each other and become maybe invincible, or perhaps they just do more damage, or have more defense, or more health, or what have you. Just having a way to incentivize the players to not just go to the nearest guy and hit him a couple times and then he dies. Having a more strategic, the title of the video, the strategic, giving your players the ability to have a more strategic approach to combat is a very important thing for you to do, and is just a viable strategy. Wow, I'm mentioning the word strategy many times in this video. An example of giving your players the ability to kind of strategize a little more, having a bunch of ranged enemies in the back that do a lot more damage than the melee guys up front incentivizes the fast monk to just go back there and break a couple bones real quick, so that the guys back at the front line take a little less damage. Moving on to player strategy. This one's actually a little easier to talk about because players, I feel, get a little more opportunity to strategize. Which might seem strange given the DM is usually the one planning everything to begin with, but hear me out. Players have the freedom to do just about anything that the DM puts in front of them, allowing them to just go, hey, you know what? I'm not going to do this. I'm going to come back when I have a giant drill dozer where I can go straight through the ancient door instead of asking it's a riddle. Obviously that's an extreme funny example, but you get the point. There's always a unique thing for the player to do in any situation. And one of my favorite things to do is to actually look for the smaller items. And what I mean by the smaller items is I mean the things that you can buy at any medieval general store, like vials of acid, rope, vials of oil, buckets, bags, and so on. One of my favorite strategies as a player myself was I would go to every general store in a city, or just any store that would have vials of oil. I'd collect as much oil as I could, and as my paladin, which later became a homebrew class, I would go to whatever we're doing, whether it be combat or a puzzle, and I'd see where I could use the oil. And you have no idea how many times oil specifically, just oil alone, was super useful to the situation. Whether it be collapsing a cave or lighting an enemy on fire, which is the main deal of oil, or perhaps just making a slippery path, or my favorite, blast jumping my paladin across the map. But finding these small items and just being aware of what you're putting in your inventory and being like, what can I do to use this? Creates so many new strategies for you as a player, especially in earlier levels where you have less to work with, that it's really worth doing. And if you're not familiar with the items, just go ahead and go check the books that they're in and see and come up with ideas and see what you can do. Now, perhaps not all your strategies will work. Say you get a rope and you cover it in oil, light it on fire, and you try hitting someone with it. That might burn your character's hand and it might not work out. But the crazy thing about Dungeons & Dragons is you can adapt. Growing your inventory, learning what's in it, and perhaps seeing what your fellow party members have in their inventory can really open up a lot of weird and fun and interesting opportunities. In maybe not just combat, but everywhere. And kind of growing off of using your fellow party members, another way to increase your strategic abilities is to learn what your other party members can do. Familiarize yourself with what class they are, what subclass they are, perhaps what background features they have, if that is of any importance. And especially if they're a spellcaster, try to learn what spells that they have access to. For example, your wizard casting haste, or perhaps even enlarge on your barbarian can turn them from barbarian into a war machine, capable of destroying everything everyone has ever known. Or perhaps you have the party paladin stand next to the party wizard, and at later levels, the paladin has the aura, which gives them advantage on saving throws, and as a wizard, you need to make a lot of those to maintain concentration. These are interesting combos that are very much intended in the game, but you might not think of right away. Perhaps there are some out there which are not really intended, but work magnificently. And if you have any wacky, crazy combos that you've ever used as a player, please let me know in the comments, because I'm curious to hear and see fun new ideas that perhaps I can use in my own games. I'm certain other viewers would love to know them as well. What this all boils down to is this: being consistently aware, whether you're the DM or the player, of what everyone else at the table is doing will allow you to grow your strategic abilities tenfold. Watching how people do things, even watching your DM if you are the player and how they do things, can kind of help you anticipate your next scenario. Now obviously you're not going to be able to have some like mind reading powers and just predict everything that's going to happen, whether you are the player or the DM, because we're human, we're not mind flayers. But just getting a more comfortable feel of how things are going and how things usually go, oh, this is going to make you crazy. It's going to make you crazy at the table, and very successful. And beyond just being successful, it will make the environment of the table a lot more fun and interesting, and dynamic, and all these other buzzwords. Like I said with my paladin and all the crazy oil shenanigans I did, it brought this laughter and this fun to the table that wasn't there normally when it was a very dire situation, because we were all low on HP, and we were all like sitting there like waiting for the DM to be like, oh, does a 32 hit the player? Oh, yes it does. Oh, how much damage is that? 69. And when my paladin on 2 health pulls out like 3 gallons of oil, lights it on fire, and chucks it at someone, that lightens the mood quite a bit. So, if you have anything to add, please do so in the comments. Love to read it. And I bid all of you adieu. Goodbye. Goodbye. That's not what I normally say. I say adios.